Hello everyone and welcome to Act 4 Scene 1 of Othello. We've just got 2 acts to go, so well done for making it this far. Now at the start of Act 4 there's been a lot of discussion about Desdemona's handkerchief, and we know that this handkerchief is now in the possession of Bianca, who is Cassio's mistress. And at the start of Act 4, Iago and Othello enter the scene, and Iago is taunting Othello. Obviously, Othello doesn't see it like that, but Iago is trying to plant ideas of Desdemona's infidelity in his mind, and he causes a huge disruption of Othello's psychological state. And this is our big question for today. How does Shakespeare portray this psychological disintegration of the central character? And we're going to be exploring the language of this scene in order to support our response to this question. So let's get started. As they enter, Iago is telling Othello that he knows that Desdemona has been naked with her friend in bed. She's been naked with Cassio in bed, an hour or more, not meaning any harm. So Iago is trying to present Desdemona's behaviour, to defend Desdemona's behaviour as being, quite honourable. She didn't mean anything by it. She was just lying there with Cassio. But of course we know that this is all a carefully constructed lie meant to enrage Othello, even as Iago pretends to be considerate towards his friend. And Othello says, naked in bed, Iago, and not mean harm, in his hypocrisy against the devil. They that mean virtuously, and yet do so, the devil their virtue tempts, and they tempt heaven. So Othello is enraged by this suggestion that Desdemona might have been naked in bed with another man, and how hypocritical it would be for her to present herself as being virtuous, as being good, as being a moral person, whilst actually being unfaithful in private. And Iago says, so they do nothing, 'tis a venial slip. So it doesn't mean anything, Othello, let's just forget about it. I'm sorry I even mentioned it. Of course, he's not sorry that he mentioned it. 'Tis a venial slip, but if I give my wife a handkerchief. So Iago's speaking as if these ideas are just occurring to him. But of course, this is all carefully planned and designed to create this level of jealousy and psychological distress for Othello. And when Iago brings up the idea of the handkerchief, what he means here is not a little bit of fabric, but he means if I give my wife a symbol of my love and she possesses this as a symbol of her sexual loyalty to me. Because then Iago says, it's hers, my lord, and being hers, she may, I think, bestow it on any man. So on one level, Iago means, well, she could give this love token to any other man she wants because she's not my possession, she's completely free. But what Iago actually means is if she gives this handkerchief to someone else, that means that she's giving her body to someone else as well, because the handkerchief comes to stand in for Desdemona's body. It's interesting that Iago is still addressing Othello as my lord, so he's pretending this huge level of respect for Othello that actually he doesn't have, and he uses the phrase the more to talk about Othello elsewhere. So we have this winding up of Othello, I suppose, is a way to phrase it, enraging of Othello and deliberate manipulation of the tragic hero's mind. And Othello says in response to this, oh, it comes over my memory as doth the raven over the infectious house, boding to all, he had my handkerchief. Now, I've highlighted the word memory here because it's quite interesting. Othello remembers that he's seen various things. He remembers that he's seen Cassio talking to Desdemona. He remembers that Cassio has his handkerchief, but memory isn't a stable, definite concept in the play. People remember things, but they remember them incorrectly. And this is interesting because Othello he knows that his memory is genuine, but it's been twisted by Iago, and so Othello's memories aren't clear. And then he talks about the raven. Now, if you've watched or studied Macbeth, you'll know that the raven in Macbeth symbolises death. It symbolises a sense of foreboding and the fact that Macbeth is going to murder King Duncan, and which would have been a crime that would have been absolutely appalling to the Renaissance imagination. So the raven here has a similar idea of foreboding, of the inevitable downfall that's going to is going to result at the end of the play, and the raven would have been a symbol of death that the audience would have been familiar with. It's also interesting because birds in literature often represent this idea of transcendence, of rising above all of the difficulties of the human world and achieving a kind of heavenly state of morality and purity and so on. Whereas this is a bird, but like everything that Iago has anything to do with in the play, it becomes debased. So rather than symbolising transcendence, it symbolises death and destruction. And then Othello talks about an infectious house. Now, it's a little bit like the quotation from Hamlet, there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. There's something rotten, there's something infected in Othello's house, in his family. So on the one level, this is infection because he feels like his marriage has been diseased in some way. And think about all of the connotations that disease would have had. So at the time, there would have been relatively few treatments or cures for different diseases, so it would be considered to be relatively unstoppable. At the time, there was also a lot of concern about the plague, which shut down theatres, which killed so many people. And so this idea of infection would have been profoundly disturbing for the audience. You know, they would have heard the concept of infection and thought, this is the end, this is something that will result in death. So we have that sense of inevitability there as well. We also know that infections spread from house to house. We've talked a lot about the coronavirus in recent weeks and months, and so again we see Othello as the head of state here, someone who, if his house, if his family and his mind are infected, then that's going to spread throughout the rest of society and bring everybody into a state of chaos. And then Othello returns to the handkerchief. He had my handkerchief, he had my wife's body, is what Othello is thinking to himself here. So a little bit later on, Iago enrages Othello even more. He completely convinces Othello that Desdemona is having an affair, and Othello's mind breaks down. And it starts reasonably logically here. He says, lie with her, lie on her. So he's imagining Desdemona and Cassio having a sexual relationship. He says, we say lie on her when they belie her. Lie with her, zounds, that's fulsome. So he's starting to use profanity, swear words. And then he goes back to the idea of the handkerchief. So his mind starts to move very quickly from one idea to another. And we can see that there's logic here, but he's making connections between things that actually aren't connected. Desdemona being accused of having an affair with Cassio, linking that in with the handkerchief is in Bianca's hands. So he's linking things together here, prompted by Iago. And then he says to confess and be hanged for his labour, first to be hanged and then to confess, I tremble at it. Nature would not invest herself in such shadowing passion without some instruction. It is not words that shake me thus. Pish, noses, ears and lips, is it possible? Confess, handkerchief, oh devil. So how this is acted on the stage would be with an increasing level of irrational violence, possibly distress, and then Othello falls into a trance, which many critics have interpreted as being an epileptic fit. And if you look at the progress of Othello's language throughout this speech, it becomes increasingly chaotic. He says pish, noses, ears and lips, so he's moving from an idea about nature, about how people learn to be unfaithful, I suppose, to an obsession with different body parts. And then he says, is it possible? So he's asking Iago. And then we've got these kind of statements, confess, which he's probably shouting at this point, and going back to the handkerchief, and then thinking about devils. So it's all very confused. It's also said in prose, which is really interesting, because we know that blank verse is often, not always, but often in Shakespeare used to represent reasonably ordered, calm thoughts, whereas prose is often, I say often, it's not always, often used to represent a more chaotic state of mind, which is what we've got here. We have no sense of rhythm or organisation in Othello's speech, and we have just little fragments of sentences. Notice the punctuation as well. So we have quite a lot of dashes and exclamation marks, which indicate the irregularity of Othello's speech. And then we have this trance, this epileptic fit. So we have a tragic hero, someone who's the leader of the army. He's the head of state in Cyprus, and he's now lying on the stage having a fit whilst the villain stands above him and does nothing to help him. You know, visually, this is a very powerful scene of Othello's complete physical and psychological vulnerability at the hands of the villain Iago. And it's not, I suppose, what we would expect from the tragic hero at this point. And it also represents a complete lack of rational thought as well, which is what we've seen progressing through this particular speech. So in terms of our big question, how does Shakespeare portray Othello's psychological disintegration? Well, in terms of the language and in terms of the staging of this particular scene. And I do recommend that you watch a version of the play so that you can get the full impact of this. Now, this particular part of the play, and as we move towards the end of the play, becomes increasingly controversial. So I've spoken a lot in these videos about how in Act 1, Scene 1, Iago is extremely racist towards Othello, and Shakespeare uses that to establish a stereotype for what the Renaissance audience would expect from a black character in a play. And Shakespeare uses that to reveal the racism of Renaissance society at the time. And then in Act 1, Scene 2 and Act 1, Scene 3, when Othello comes on stage, we have the complete opposite of that. And everything that Othello says, everything that he does, completely reverses what Iago has said in Act 1, Scene 1. And so Shakespeare there clearly engages in a critique of racism. And he says, look, these racist stereotypes are not accurate because here we have a black person who is completely different from what you expected. So Shakespeare is engaging the audience's preconceptions in Act 1, Scene 1, and then absolutely demolishing them in Act 1, Scene 2 and Act 1, Scene 3. And as a modern audience, that's something that we might feel reasonably comfortable with. In terms of the way that Shakespeare dismantles and destroys those stereotypes. Now, as we progress through the play and Shakespeare's psychological state begins to disintegrate, we become more uncomfortable. And Hugh Quashie, who's an actor who played Othello in the 2015 version of the play, really wrestled with this part. And he had said in 1998, and it is shown on the screen here, that of all the parts in the canon, perhaps Othello is the one which should most definitely not be played by a black actor, wrote British Ghanaian actor Hugh Quashie in a lecture published in 1998. Doing so risked legitimising, in fact condoning, the racist stereotype of a black man who loses his wits, then resorts to killing his white wife in a fit of crazed jealousy, Quashie argued. So as the play progresses, Othello becomes more akin to the stereotype that the Renaissance audience would have been familiar with. And for a modern audience, this is a deeply disturbing sight. And this particular actor at the time, in 1998, said that he wasn't comfortable with that because he didn't want to condone or in any way legitimise, suggest that Shakespeare's presentation of Othello is correct. He wanted to challenge that presentation of Othello. In the 2015 production, Quashie does act the character of Othello, but Iago is also played by a black actor. So it's interesting in terms of how they engage with the idea of race in that particular production. So it is a troubling scene to see Othello having an epileptic fit on the stage, to see Othello being presented as an irrational, violent, disturbed character. And one way of understanding this and aligning it with our interpretation of Act 1 is to argue that Shakespeare shows that Othello has internalised the racism that he's been exposed to every single day in Venetian society, and that Othello almost comes to believe the stereotype that he so strongly denied in Act 1. And so Shakespeare shows the impact of racism on the individual mind, you know, how overwhelming society's beliefs can be, that it leads to someone believing something that they know isn't true. So there's lots that could be said and argued and discussed about that. But engaging with the idea is something I think that's important, and engaging with critical perspectives on this idea is important as well. In terms of your independent learning then for this, I want you to think about this quotation from Dr. Johnson, who's a very well-respected academic. He's often said to have invented the dictionary, although he didn't invent it, he just compiled one. And in 1765, Johnson argued that in this play Shakespeare accurately depicted human nature, describing Othello as magnanimous, artless, and credulous, bounded in his confidence, ardent in his affection, inflexible in his resolution, and obdurate in his revenge. Now, there are some things that Johnson says that I completely don't agree with in the play, but this summing up of Othello's character, at least in Act 1 and Act 2, seems to be relatively accurate. So what I'd like you to do is create a mind map or a table in which you jot down some ideas to support each of Johnson's assertion about Othello. So break it down, think, right, what does magnanimous mean? Where is Othello magnanimous in the play? Have I got specific quotations to back up that idea? And therefore, do I agree with what Dr. Johnson has to say in this section about Othello? So thanks very much for listening, and we will look at the end of Act 4, Scene 1 in the next video.